Oops. Okay. Oops. Okay. Oops. We're going to get started because it's 2:30 and we're going to get started with this fantastic session of three great panelists that we have for you today. Let's get going. So the three panelists we have for you today, we have Christina Ganev, Ian Duncan, and Nathan Tidridge. All three of them are Ontario teachers who have been shortlisted for the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. I'm really excited that they all agreed to be here and that they're going to share their projects with you over the next hour. And hopefully you're going to have some questions and we'll be able to have some interaction through this session. So we're going to start off with Nathan Tidridge. So Nathan helped to create an outdoor educational space, the Sue Harrison Natural Area, as a place to highlight the region's Indigenous identity and contemporary treaty relationships. Nathan is here with us today, and so he can answer any questions. I'm going to play this video that he put together for his community so you can get a sense and actually take sort of a tour around the area. So let's go to the video.
Welcome to the Sue Harrison Natural Area. My name is Nathan Tidridge and I'm a local history teacher. We're here at the Monument Stone, located near the bridge on Burke Street in the eastern part of the community. If you look closely in the sidewalk, you're going to see an image of a moccasin, part of the Moccasin Identifier Project on the sidewalk. It was placed here by Carolyn King of the Mississaugas of the Credit, there she is there, on August 21st, 2014, when the natural area was officially dedicated. You see she's being helped by Chief Brian Laforme of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Lieutenant Governor David Onley, Judy Partridge, our city councillor, and Eugene Coggy, a local elder from Saugeen Nation. This image reminds us of the treaty relationships embodied by this natural area and calls us to learn more about the responsibilities we have to our treaty partners, including the land itself. So let's find out about this land. Waterdown sits atop the escarpment, overlooking the western edge of Lake Ontario. A local road, Snake Road, is actually a paved trail that connects the community to the lake, part of a network across the region. Waterdown is part of the city of Hamilton, and like all suburbs, is growing rapidly. You can see all the new developments here, particularly in this circle bit called Waterdown South. It was while driving by here a number of years ago that I noticed a lot of archaeological digs that were going on in the area. This picture captures those digs from Google Earth in 2014. They were finding all kinds of things, including this arrowhead that was found by Nicholas Schweitz in 2 pieces back in 2008. In total, 104 Indigenous sites were found, as well as these 19th century cabin foundations, believed to be those of Waterdown's first settler, Alexander Brown. These sites spoke to a much deeper history than the one I was taught about growing up here. This land has been inhabited for millennia by Indigenous people, In fact, evidence of their settlements and stores can be found throughout the area. Nearly every house built here has uncovered objects connecting this land to the thousands that lived here before. Discovering this, my students and I had to start asking a lot of difficult questions. For thousands of years, this land was filled with indigenous people, and yet Waterdown today does not really reflect that when we look around. As often happens, most of these archaeological sites that were uncovered were destroyed in order to build the subdivision that's there now. So what do we do? A committee was formed with students Holly McCann and Kakoa Reinbold, as well as Flamborough councillor Judy Partridge and Elder Eugene Coggy, a beloved teacher at the high school. I served as chair, and we reached out to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Indigenous nation whose territory Waterdown is located in, to relearn the history of this land. We learned about treaty, and in particular the Treaty of Niagara from 1764, and understood from the Mississaugas that treaties are not simply written contracts, but relationships binding the Crown and settlers with Indigenous nations. The monument stone on Burke Street, created after weeks of meetings and teachings with Elder Gary Sue of the Mississaugas, recalls some of this history. One slight correction: we have since learned that the Shawniton Nation is better identified as the neutral nation. This was told to me by some knowledge keepers with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Waterdown falls within the territories of the Haudenosaunee as well, and is located only 40 minutes from the Six Nations of the Grand River. Settlements of the Seneca Nation, members of the Confederacy, existed throughout this region. It is from the neutral nation that Elder Eugene Coggy found the name for this natural area. Sioux Harrison was a title given to one of the leaders of the neutral nation. The Sioux Harrison Natural Committee, with the support of Elder Gary Sue, presented their plan and history of the area to the Chief and Council of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation on June 23, 2014, and it was both endorsed and supported. And so, on August 21, 2014, the 55-acre Sioux Harrison Natural Area was dedicated jointly by the Honourable David C. Onley, 28th Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and Chief Brian Laforme, and Council of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Part of the dedication ceremony saw the lighting of a sacred fire, possibly the first in this region for generations, by the Mississaugas. Both the Lieutenant Governor and Chief visited the fire, as well as many members of the community. Elder Gary lit the fire at sunrise, and Rocky Burnham of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy acted as firekeeper. We have Eugene Coggy to thank for selecting the site of the fire, and in 2018, Eugene and his family marked the site of the sacred fire with a beautiful stone. You may notice a similar symbol on this stone as on the Sioux Harrison Monument Stone. Both connect the natural area to Eugene's father, Edison Coggy, a Second World War veteran and survivor of the Mohawk Institute, or Mushhole, residential school. Since its establishment, the Sioux Harrison Natural Area has become a space used by local students, clubs, including the 3rd Waterdown Scouts, and residents alike. It continues to evolve. This space challenges us to explore the ethical dimensions of what has happened on this land. 104 Indigenous sites tells us that Waterdown is an Indigenous space, that there were multiple Indigenous nations living here. Where are their voices today? What is the legacy of residential schools and the erasure of First Nation voices in this community? And what is our relationship to this land? How do we see land and the environment around us? The very word development implies improvement. Is that what we're doing? What is the land telling us? East of the Sioux Harrison Monument Stone is the Canoe Garden. The canoe was donated by a local resident who spent their youth using it to explore the lakes and islands up north. Students from Waterdown traveled to New Credit in 2015 to be gifted medicines to plant in the canoe. A small ceremony was held where Carolyn King gifted me with soil from her reserve for the garden. Both of these acts violated Canada's Indian Act. Rick Hill of the Tuscarora Nation helped student Tyler Alexis create a marker stone that asks residents about the Indian Act, highlighting the inequities Indigenous people face every day. This is also a Truth and Reconciliation Heart Garden, honoring the children lost to Canada's Indian Residential School program. Before planting this garden, Waterdown students toured Brantford's Mohawk Institute, the Mush Hole. Paper hearts representing some of the thousands of children who died in these schools are mixed into its soil. All along the main path of Sue Harrison, you will find 7 bat houses that were created in 2019 by grade 4 students from Allen A. Greenleaf, partnering with grade 11 and 12 students at Waterdown District High School. Each bat house was inspired by one of the 7 grandfather teachings students were gifted by Eugene and Cindy Coggy. Together, those elementary and secondary students studied their teachings and researched the ecosystem inhabited by the bats. Then they built and decorated those bat houses, which were installed in 2020. Go for a walk and see if you can find all 7 of the houses and reflect on their teachings. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned the 19th century cabin foundations discovered by archaeologists. Here are some pictures I took of them before they were covered over in 2008. The local historians believe that they marked the home of Waterdown's first settlers, Alexander Brown and Maren Grierson, the village's famous ghost. In 2014, student Kakoa Reinbold researched the couple and created a plaque to mark the location of the cabin. And you can see it here being unveiled by Chief Laforme and Kakoa in 2014. The plaque displays the only known image of Alexander Brown, and sadly no image of Maren survives. Both settlers are buried in the Waterdown Union Cemetery. When Carolyn King placed this mark on the ground, it challenged us to see her nation in the landscape. Each act of learning addresses that challenge and renews the relationship and reveals responsibilities between our community and its treaty partners. If you haven't already, come out and explore the area and see if there's a way that you can help take care of or contribute to it.
Sorry, it looks like I stopped the video stopped sharing before I stopped the video. We're all learning. Thank you, Nathan, for that amazing video. And I'm going to ask any participants to put any questions in the chat, and we'll address them all at the end, unless there was anything else you wanted to add to this, Nathan.
Is it okay if I do a land acknowledgement on behalf of the panelists?
Yes, please. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you. I am honored to do a land acknowledgement on behalf of my colleagues here. We are all actually, even though we're in Zoom land, we are actually all on territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as the Wendat Huron Nation. But there are also many Indigenous people here as well. It's a beautiful day in the territory. But as you may have heard in the news, that there are some troubling things going on here that people need to pay attention to, I think. And I'm speaking specifically of what's happening at 1492 Landback Lane and the incidents that happened yesterday where rubber bullets were involved and people are in pain. So I put that forward, as well as what's happening in the waters surrounding Mi'kma'ki out on the East Coast. So we are really privileged to be here, but there is a lot of examples going on right now in this territory and in territories across the land that highlight that this relationship it needs to be healed, and people need to listen more. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nathan, for that great introduction. My apologies for not having you do that right from the top. So we're back on the slides. Again, if you have questions at any point, just pop them into the chat. So I'm going to introduce you now to Ian Duncan. So Ian created an LGBTQ2+ history learning module, including often overlooked people and events, experiences, and identity in queer history. So I'm going to ask Ian to unmute and.
Oh, there we go. I was too quick on the unmute button there. Sorry, Rachel. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to my co-presenters and of course to Rachel as well before we get started. We're really, I'm sorry, I'm binging and dinging here. The work that I've been doing over the last several years is to try to bring LGBTQ2 plus history to the mainstream of a history classroom. I know that I'm not the only educator doing this work, but to me it was very special and certainly a unique opportunity for me to explore the moments of history and the different people that are making up a community that I belong to very proudly. There are so many elements of this that can be seen in our society, and I start and often work with students around the creation of protest buttons like these to reference the queer history and the LGBTQ2 plus experience that they are learning about in our lessons. These are primary source documents that come from the archives, formerly the Gay and Lesbian Archives of Canada, located here in Toronto. And certainly they inform a lot of inspiration for helping students find out what's going on in this time period. And they look at the dates and they look at the slogans, and those kinds of things have certainly been very inspirational to students. I mean, a button for a long time wasn't a big deal, and now we're seeing a revival of the button in our students and in our hallways, in our classrooms. So it's something that more and more people are relating to. It's an interesting sort of tangible item. But we also talk about the importance of a button and what putting on a button like this in history would signal to others. This was about taking people in a community that may be, as they might say, passing, and identifying themselves in a way that makes them sort of known to others for their queer identities. It was something that I do very often and experience consistently in my school, wearing rainbow pins myself. And it goes back to an experience in university where I literally out myself by wearing a marker of my sexual orientation. And these buttons become more powerful when we think about what they would mean to someone who would put them on in history, and allow us to sort of engage that historical perspective, as well as that just generalized historical experience. Could you advance the slide, please, Rachel? This is me and my family, and I wanted to share that with everybody today. My husband and my son Carson, who was adopted at birth privately 7 years ago. He's a 7-year-old bundle of trouble, I call him. And these are the people that have informed the reason why I'm teaching. They also represent the change of history. When I came out in 1998, my marriage was not legal, and my adoption rights were not confirmed. And in this province, in Ontario, and in many provinces across the country. And in the last 22 years of my out and proud experience, those things have changed. And so it's bringing myself and my family's story and my own story into the classroom that for me has really enriched that reason. I am not, in my opinion, someone who passes. My kids know fairly quickly of my sexual orientation and my identity, but I didn't talk about it much. And it was when I started to talk about it more and digest some contemporary events in our world's history in the last few years that students really found their way into the history with me. I also was shocked to be learning. I learned by listening to Justin Trudeau's apology in 2017. I sat at my desk in my office here at school, just down this long hallway, and I'm watching an apology that I said, I didn't know this. And then I had to ask, why don't I know this? I'm a proud gay man, a father and husband, and yet I don't know the history that's my history. And where and why is that the case? I have studied in university. I have studied in teachers' college faculties. I have studied beyond those things. I'm a reader. I'm curious. I'm a member of a community. And how come I know so little of this history for myself? as an individual, for my own pride, and also for the pride of my family? How do I instill that in my son? How do I help my husband, who is not a history buff, get into that aspect of his own identity? And immediately, of course, I go to the other relationships that I build every day in my work, which is with my students. I challenge every one of you today to think about what life is currently like for your LGBTQ2 plus students, and to think about what it would mean to learn in a truly embedded and committed way an aspect of their queer history. I challenge you to help them to see that, because I don't think it's necessarily that their parents will be able to help them to see those things. And so for me, I become an elder in the community that is able to pass along the knowledge that I've gained through the learning I've done so far. There's so much more to learn. I have just begun a long process of learning, and every time I learn history, I bring it to any classroom and any environment, be it with my staff here at school and teachers, people who ask for advice or me to consult on things, because all of these voices are relevant. I talk about the acronym with my students really openly, and I wanted to review this with you as well. Understanding that the acronym is shifting. There are actually even more letters to an expanded acronym, but this is the acronym I've been using in my classes most recently. I do use the term queer and reference queer history. That's a word that some students and some staff find uncomfortable, because it can be slur oriented, but I've reclaimed that word. It is not a label that I use to define myself, but it is a label that I use to talk about the history of an expanded LGBTQIP2SAA plus community. And some of these words are familiar to you and some of them are not. Regardless, these are all words that my students are using to identify themselves. At our school, just outside of Toronto, we polled our students in a survey, as many schools and systems do, and 13% of them 2 years ago identified as other than straight. 13%. So if you apply that statistic to your classrooms, if you don't collect those statistics, or you don't like the questions that collect those statistics and your system surveys, then I encourage you to work with your administration around those things. For us, it was very enlightening, because it revealed the hundreds of students in our school that are identifying within the LGBTQ2 plus community. Two-spiritedness is very important to this, as well as the discussion around intersecting identities. I think we really need to go beyond just looking at an LGBTQ2 plus community and really think about the intersection of queer people of color, for example. That's really, really critical to sort of the ongoing nature of my work and learning, is really bringing in those voices, and certainly work that when we do embed Black history in my course, we look for queer Black voices. When we talk about South Asian history in my course, we're talking about queer South Asian voices as well. I also invite everybody to be an ally, and to know that the A in the LGBTQ2 plus acronym references being an ally. Being an ally is critical, and it's certainly a way in which every person who chooses to be an ally can join this community. That we don't have to think of the LGBTQ2 plus community as an other group, but instead an opportunity where we can actually all join into a singular group, is really important, and certainly can bridge gaps between communities, because if you're an ally, then you join the community. You become a letter of our acronym. Slide, please. This is the Progress Pride flag. It comes out of Philadelphia, and there are other ones that are around as well. And it is the Pride flag that we fly at my house now. And you can see that this is the traditional Pride flag that it was altered from Gilbert Baker's flag from around 1978 into the 6 original rainbow colors. But we certainly have added some stripes. And that's why I fly this flag. It represents the trans community with the white, pink, and blue, and the trans flag. And it also adds the black and brown stripes to represent that intersectionality. And if we're talking about acknowledging the groups within the groups of a queer community, it's really important that we acknowledge and represent trans voices and queer people of color as well in our work. Slide, please. The challenge of teaching LGBTQ2 plus for me has always been about understanding so many identities within one community. And I've learned most from my students. Their identities, when they are out and they are sharing those identities, at least with me, have allowed me to learn from them. They're typically very passionate about their own identities, and so they're researching their own identities and bringing that knowledge back to me. There are books that I'm continuing to read because it's not just about white gay men. That it's so much more than that in the queer community, and so many of queer representations in media are not necessarily always looking at that intersectionality that I think is really important. If we don't go beyond in more intersectional ways, and also in looking at many different letters of the acronym, then we're reinforcing the privilege of some identities over others. And I think that we're sort of of the same mindset. I know my colleagues agree with me on the panel today that you know, we need to be looking at intersection, but also that labels don't even necessarily fit for every student. And students aren't always comfortable with certain labels, but know that they're identifying differently. So managing those conversations is key. Last slide. I think I'm on the last one. This is an overview of the work, and I provided the lesson resources link for everybody as well. These are my GG lessons, the lessons that I packaged up for my award submissions. So I wanted to share those with you today. There's explanations of the lesson plan, as well as all materials are sort of linked in there. And these are the questions that have evolved from my students. It actually didn't start with the first lesson. It started with the last lesson. At the end of my course in 2016 with the Pulse nightclub shootings in June, and students said, well, we need to know more. And so I came out to my students. I started talking openly 4 years ago with my students about my identity. And we evolved timeline work and talked about the events that have defined my identity, my adoption rights, my marriage rights. And then we started to go backwards because they said, well, when did this start? Like, if this is when marriage is, well, was that the first rights? And I was like, well, no. And then we look at decriminalization. So we flipped to lesson 2 and we developed something around quote unquote decriminalization that wasn't really a decriminalization of sorts, but it was a moment and a turning point in the openness of a queer community. From there, the students wanted to explore change makers, which is a popular component of my course as always. So we worked on a whole 2 semesters of just looking at queer change makers and the LGBTQ2 plus Canadians that are changing the story of Canada and bringing their voices to light in our classroom. The hardest to research was LGBTQ2 plus in World War II. When we look at history before 1969 and the quote unquote decriminalization, records are slim because people self-destroyed. They destroyed records, they destroyed evidence of sexual orientation and gender identity as a way to protect themselves from the law, a law that could punish them for their identity. And so there is some great research out there, but it is not abundant. I've been scouring through books from the United States and from the UK, but there's one definitive book and one definitive documentary from the World War II era of Canada that has really informed my knowledge here, and certainly allowed me to bring a Canadian focus to my students. It's that period that I'm currently finding most fascinating, mostly because it's the history that really does feel like it was hidden on purpose. It was hidden by society, but it was hidden by ourselves. It's hard to sort of think about my community hiding itself. And creating its own hidden history is something that's an interesting perspective to explore as well. The resources are there, and I encourage you to include queer voices in your classroom.
Okay, thank you so much, Ian. That was perfect, right on schedule. If you have questions for Ian, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. I'm seeing lots of great questions and lots of love from the audience. So thanks so much for shouting that out. And we'll do questions after Christina's had the chance to present. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Christina Ganev. So she's created a project where her students collect and share primary source heritage or immigration stories and artifacts. And I'm going to put it on your first slide here, Christina, and I'm going to get out of the way.
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, everybody. And it's an honor to present with my colleagues, Nathan and Ian. And I'd like to talk about my project for my GG submission, which is called either My Land, My History or My Canada, My History, depending on how the students identify. At my school, we really, we rarely have students who identify as Indigenous, but as we know, that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have Indigenous students in our classes. So we have varying aspects of the project for different students as they identify. And I just wanted to start off with this quote because I did this project in partnership with the University of Toronto over the last few years. Stories encode history, reflect culture, show us how social changes come about. And this project really is about the sharing of stories in history. And this quote is from Sally Tagliamonte, who is the chair of the Department of Linguistics at the University of Toronto and my partner in this project. She also happens to be the mom of a former student. I taught the old course, LVV 4U1, maybe you remember, Classical Civilizations. And one of my students went home and told her, Mom, you have to find a way to work with my teacher. And I got this call out of the blue years ago when I was already doing this assignment. And she wasn't the chair at the time, she was a professor in the Department of Linguistics. Sally asked me, how can we work together? How can we study language together and use language to study history? And so I floated this project to her, and it's been in development ever since. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why do this project? Why did I do this project? And I'll just give a description. In this project, my students conduct research into their family's heritage or immigration history, share cultural knowledge and ways of knowing, and make connections to significant events in Canadian history. And we partner with the University of Toronto to help students record and share their stories as creating history in real time. So I was inspired to create this project to find out more about my students, their heritage and their families, and to also foster a sense of connection to my students and their peers and belonging in our community. So it really comes from my own background as having moved and lived in 5 different countries before settling in Canada. And my family came here as refugees from Sri Lanka, but via many other countries. So Nigeria, Italy, England, New York in the United States, Montreal, and then finally various parts of Toronto. So I always come to my work with a curiosity for where my students are from and what ways of knowing that they intrinsically have that maybe they don't have the opportunity to share. And all the way through school, I never really did investigate my own family's background or heritage. And I would always look around my classes and think, I'd love to know more about my peers in my own classes in high school and university, and not having the opportunity, I wanted to make that right in my own classes. So when I started teaching the Canadian history course about 6 years ago, I had this opportunity. So students love this project because it's all about them. And we know that teenagers love to talk about themselves. But often what I find curious is that they don't know their own cultural heritage. And the biggest eye opener for me is students saying, I don't even know where my family is from. I had no idea where my family is from. And some of the things that I find out, they're actually mind-blowing. So I love this project. A few cautions before starting this project, and I think that it's really important in doing culturally responsive and relevant work, is in having a trauma-informed approach. So in my case, in asking students to talk about their immigration or talking about their heritage, we always have to have a discussion about, who our students are. If we have Indigenous students, if students have been adopted, have grown up in the foster care, or their parents or guardians or caretakers have, students who have been displaced, forcibly moved, who have multiple families, and also looking at this project through a settler lens, and including a land acknowledgement in every presentation that we make. So having opt-outs and modification is really, really important. So while I've linked this assignment here for everyone to use, I really caution that we address all of these things. And another thing that I do is I don't do this project until at least midway through the course, when I have built a community of care and compassion and understanding for one another. And that's really important because we need to build the trust with our students, and they have to know that the space that they're in is really genuinely safe, not just words that we use to say this is a safe space, that we have created a safe space through action. So in terms of how this project is done, most of the research is done at home, but we do a portion of this project is academic research. And then we do presentations in person, and in this blended mode, we've done it virtually. So the first task of this project, and I don't need to show you, it's kind of boring once you get into it, but task 1 asks students to create either a family tree or a community tree. So if they don't want to present about their family or research for a variety of different reasons, they can choose another community, they can choose a friend, they can choose a neighbor, and investigate into their family's history. And I ask them to look into their settlement and look at continuity and change, what has remained the same over time and what has changed. In the second task, this is my favorite part, I ask students to bring in a cultural artifact, whatever that is, and to demonstrate cultural ways of knowing. So beyond food, beyond clothing, what does the food represent? What does it mean? What does the clothing mean? And I've had students bring things, someone brought in a 100-year-old prayer mat. Another student brought in a 75-year-old Scottish shortbread recipe book and made shortbread for all of us. That was a big hit. Food's always a big hit. I had a student who was a Syrian refugee bring in an entire buffet for the class and speak to what food and gathering and community means to her, especially in terms of healing from the war and displacement and coming to Canada. I've had students bring in very old Bibles, medals from their grandparents, and that's the most heartwarming and wonderful part, to show students that they really are a part of history. And they often deny that and say, oh, my family didn't contribute, I don't really matter. And for me, it's really changing. It's that mind shift that I see happening when students are engaging in this project. The third task is the academic portion, the research portion. So we will work with the Archives of Ontario, often to try to find out more about their families, or various academic sites where we research both policies, immigration policies, or laws that have affected the student's family over time. And another very important part of the project is recognizing Indigenous presence wherever their family settled. So what else was going on at the time when your family was here? So choose a period of time and talk about an event, research the event, really acknowledge that we are all on stolen land as settlers if we don't identify as Indigenous. And so that is an eye-opener for some students. So in terms of the exemplar, Rachel, if you don't mind clicking on that first one, I'll just show you what it might look like. And then I'll speak to the last task. So this is just one student, so you can just get a gist if you scroll through very quickly of a family tree. The student chose to speak about her Tibetan history. Please continue. And so she spoke about Tibetans in India, where she was before she came to Canada. Continue. And then she provides some background. Keep going, please. Yeah. Where students have landed in Canada, and she speaks about family reunification and immigration and refugee protection. And Stephen Harper, things she remembers about Stephen Harper, she chose to speak about that. And then missing and murdered Indigenous women, and a Tibetan artifact here, which is a kata, or a greeting scarf. And she brought the scarf into class and had her friend come up to the front and demonstrated how it would be used. Continue. I think that may be near the end. Yes. Oh, yeah. And then you see her sources at the end. Thank you. And Rachel, I think the exemplar doesn't work at the bottom, but I wanted to play the last portion of the assignment, which is task 4 of the assignment, asks students to conduct interviews with 2 family members, preferably, but it can be anyone from their community, a younger person and an older person, and ask them to tell a story. And we are curating this story to create a database of these stories for a living museum that we'll have in our school ultimately. So what we would really like is the oral history from the families in our school. So let me just see if I can pull up the story.
Yeah, Christina, you might need to share your screen. I don't know if you can do that. If it doesn't work, we can just move along to the questions. We've got a few good ones.
Okay, Let me just stop my.
I really wanted to hear it, but.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a student who interviewed his 9-year-old brother, and his 9-year-old brother just spoke about Tim Hortons donuts. So some of these stories, I know the students always say, well, what can I ask these people about? And I say anything that they believe to be their Canadian experience or their lived experience here. And so it's a 9-year-old brother saying, I love Tim Hortons, and I love when they come out with the special Canadian donuts, like when the Raptors won or when the Maple Leafs, because I bite into those crunchy sprinkles and I see my little slice of Canadiana, my Maple Leafs or my donuts. And it was just such a great story that a student just played 2 days ago in class that really made us all laugh. And some of the stories are heartbreaking and interesting, and we get the wide range of stories from everybody, but that was just sort of a fun one that I wanted to share. And I wanted to acknowledge that the University of Toronto graduate students in the Department of Linguistics works with my students to hone their interview skills, to teach them how to get authentic stories out of people rather than just interview. So that last part really is credit to the department and the graduate students of Sally Tagliamonte.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've still got 20 minutes for questions, so please feel free to pop them in there. I'm having a little bit of technical glitches, but I'm hoping to get to it. So I've got one displayed right now that is for Nathan, and then the next one's for you, Ian. So Nathan, did you experience any institutional pushback or problems getting permissions or creating relationship between board and Indigenous people in your project?
Ooh. That's a big question. Yes. The way in which education is structured, it's not conducive to doing a project that's outside of the school and that is asking you to, a lot of travel back and forth to the reserve to meet with elders, and also to have elders come into the school. You come up against a lot of, I would use the term systemic barriers to that. I'm a settler, so I'm not an Indigenous person. So I have to, I can only go so far, and I can look at the settler responsibilities within the treaty relationship. But we have to have a full relationship with our Indigenous partners as well. And so, making those connections is key. Having the freedom to go and talk to the elders, having them come into the school is really key as well. And so that requires a very flexible administration, the ability to leave the school with your students. It's just a local park, but that seems, it's getting increasingly hard to do that with paperwork and protocols and things like that. So, so yes, unfortunately, it is difficult, and you kind of just have to persevere. What I've learned over the past years is that relationships are key to this, meaningful relationships over a long period of time, and so that requires, especially when you're dealing in an institution, a lot of flexibility and a lot of understanding to make that work.
Great. Thank you so much, Nathan. I can't even imagine the amount of time, effort I went into everything that you've done. So Ian, the question for you. So somebody wants to know what you do if students express that they're not comfortable speaking about LGBTQIA+ issues in class due to their religion.
Very honestly, even in a diverse classroom, I haven't really had a student express their lack of comfort due to religion around the topic. I mean, I'm very honest. I wonder if just my presence and the openness of my identity in my classroom and teaching this work has also, there's a power dynamic there. As much as we try to build relationships that unsettle that power dynamic, that I found that a lot of them, based on respect anyway, have allowed me to sort of lead the lesson. And I have also noticed that even students who you might, and I really don't work to assume a student's religious position, but the students who you might have said, oh, that is something that that someone who might be struggling with this is not the case. And in fact, recent statistics have shown that religious communities across the country of all sorts have demonstrated a lot more tolerance So, you know, like making those assumptions is wrong. I think we saw just, I think it was yesterday, Pope Francis announced the sort of acceptance of civil marriage between same-sex couples, which is like, that's landmark from the Roman Catholic Church, for example. So there is change, and using that change and showing students those changes has helped. To Christina's point earlier, I don't start here week one. Like, this is sort of where we go when the relationships are built. And when I can create not just a safe space for me to be vulnerable, because one of the lessons involves an interview of me. And I always say, if I'm not there in your classroom, what do? We'll find somebody from the LGBTQ community to bring in to interview and to sort of let students ask questions to. But that is something that the building of relationships has helped me to sort of overcome any barriers, because it's not always just religion that defines a student's lack of comfort. We often talk about getting uncomfortable to do the work. And that's with reference to all kinds of different experiences and narratives in Canadian history. And so trying to support their lack of comfort in the community that we build and the relationships of the classroom, and hopefully an open dialogue that if students are truly uncomfortable, we have a conversation rather than them just pushing it away. It doesn't mean I haven't experienced, not like, I would say open comments. I'm not even going to call it microaggression. I'm going to call it full-on aggression from students, but it's never been for me. Students have never cited their religion as a refusal for doing the learning.
Thank you, Ian. I think that is definitely going to be an issue in some communities more than others, perhaps. So I've got a question for Christina. So the question is, Christina, did you find it more difficult during this pandemic to do this project?
Slightly more difficult, definitely difficult during the closure period when we tried to do this project. So typically we would actually go to the U of T and experience a lecture from Sally and see her graduate students in person, and they would coach the students and interview the students themselves for their linguistics lab in person. So having to, I hate the word pivot, but I'll use the pivot, adapt or pivot to this model. We had Sally join us on a virtual call and give her lecture about the significance of language and the evolution of language over time, and really address the historical thinking concepts too in the project. So that's been really helpful. So having her in the virtual class and for students to see a professor from the U of T has been really great in engaging them. In terms of getting all the students to work with the graduate students, that was 50-50. A lot of them slept in, didn't check their email. This is just teacher honesty. Didn't follow through, showed up very late to the interviews, had to reschedule. But in the end, the majority of the students in my class did engage with the graduate students and had 1-hour interviews and learned those interview skills. And every single one of them do this project, which is why I continue to do it. It's the one that gets the most buy-in. It's the one where students are most academically successful, the most engaged. And I can immediately sense, it's very palpable, that sense of community and the bond that our class forms immediately after everybody has presented and shared these stories. So I think we need this even more now to foster that sense of engagement and community building where everybody feels isolated and not connected to one another. Even if we're just teaching virtually through a computer, it makes a big difference.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. So I'm not seeing any more questions. I don't know if you guys are seeing this, but there's so much love in the Q&A for you guys. So a lot of people, not really so much a question as a thank you. I've learned a great deal from the work that each of you have shared online in the Twitter sphere. I'm grateful for that. So I highly recommend everybody follow all these three on Twitter. They're amazing. They're always sharing incredible things from their own classrooms. So yeah, I mean, several recommendations, and another one to thank you for Ian for being brave, for sharing your curiosity, and for encouraging us to be mindful and to be inclusive of all histories. I'm grateful for your work and sharing it with all of us today. And very inspirational, all of you. And thank you so much also to Canada's History Society for making these Governor General's Awards a reality. It's such an amazing way to showcase the work that we are doing in our classrooms and to celebrate it and to take time to celebrate it. And I think, you know, pandemic or no, we know that history teachers are doing amazing things in the classroom all the time. So don't be afraid, like put your application in, nominate a colleague. It's a fantastic experience and a fantastic way to help each other. So just somebody's going to join Twitter because of you guys. So just so you know, I'm going to display that question. Yeah, I've got to hop over to the closing ceremonies. So I'm going to end the live stream. Thank you to all three panelists for being here and for making this an amazing presentation.